Okay, this isn't going to be pleasant. I'm dealing with Christopher Lasch's book, The Culture of Narcissism, especially the stuff in chapter 4. There's a lot of people asking right now, maybe for the first time, even though we should have been asking this question for the last few decades, and Christopher Lasch was asking it back in the late 1970s. Why are we at this point of extreme skepticism, anger, alienation, and what I would call ideological possession? Here we have Mr. Costco man with his shirt that says, running the world since 1776. And here he is in Costco yelling and screaming at some female customer, apparently an older woman, who was asking him to put on his mask per store policy. And he screams, "I'm threatened. I feel threatened." This is not a picture of manhood and courage, is it? This is kind of pathetic. And this has become a symbol. This type of reaction has become a kind of symbol of our time. Here we have a Costco Karen. Something similar going on here. I can't remember whether it was really Costco or some other big box store. But this particular older lady decided that she didn't want to wear a mask in that store, and she sat down in protest and was videotaped doing that. Again, is this what we want to be doing, in this case, in our old age? I asked that last time. I'm asking it here again. This kind of foolery is demeaning to people, and it begs the question, what the heck is going on, right? There's more and more of this. Well, Lasch, gives us answers that don't leap readily to mind, right? They're deeper answers. And this is one of the many reasons I like Christopher Lasch. He, in this chapter, talks a lot about how we work, what we do on the job, how work has changed. And one of the things that he points out is that work has become, in effect, easier and easier in the sense that it requires less thought. So work, he's not just talking about desk jobs, he's talking about just about any kind of job other than the skilled crafts type jobs. Like I had somebody come and cut my huge tree down today, half my tree. The guys on a job like that have to problem solve still. They have to use their skills to be able to figure out how to get this tree down without ruining anything. They got to know exactly where to land it and so on. But outside of jobs like that, and maybe jobs like mine where we're paid to think and we can't really totally get around it, although some of us can give it a good try, there's a lot of jobs that don't require nearly as much thinking because we've automated and we've systematized to the point where we can, plug one person in after another into that position with standard operating procedures and the technology that makes it easier. And so Lasch says more and more people are working at jobs that are, quote, beneath their abilities. Among other things, this is boring, but more than boring, it's a lot of our life. A lot of our life is spent working, okay? Even if we're working at home, this is still the case. We've gone from being able to apply our problem-solving skills to supply our family to just opening a box, okay? So work is work, and it's become easier all around, and it is, he says, largely beneath our abilities. So we are occupied with a lot of time spent where we cannot really feel like we're doing something meaningful. And our non-work hours, he says, are also becoming more work-like. Now, Mackenzie Wark, who wrote much later and is still writing, gave us this idea that we work even when we play. If we're on the internet or we're walking around using our phone, right? We are in effect working for the companies that want to mine our data, right? But Lasch points out that consuming itself is work, that once we got to the point where we were producing everything people really needed, the economy still needed to grow because people, investors and owners needed to make more money. And so along came, consumer production and the massaging of people's needs to produce needs and desires that weren't there before. Okay, so if we can include data mining and shopping and consuming, and all of them are very much tied up together, we are working mindlessly for most of our waking hours, according to this perspective, which I largely agree with. And of course, we don't therefore backfill with human relationships. One of the things that we could do with, something like full automation, or, we're getting there, is to take the time that we used to spend in work in creating and maintaining relationships, caring for each other at the emotional level, doing things that cannot be done still by machines or shouldn't be. But instead we don't, because we've become very, very isolated. We've become artificially individualistic. And because work appears to or feels so meaningless lots of times, the way that we get ahead, or the way that we feel like we've accomplished something, becomes more about how we project our persona and how we appear to other people, right? So we jockey for those impressions that we leave upon people, and he says that we role play, okay? We begin to act parts and to live very inauthentically, not ourselves, but acting the part that we think is desirable in the eyes of others. As we do this, we have to confront the question of meaninglessness, although a lot of us do that very unconsciously, really. We confront meaninglessness by filling the void with consumer products, or like last time we talked about therapy, as in, retail therapy and other types of activities that are designed to make us somehow feel better. We're directed inward to neurotic self-awareness, which just heightens the need for something to come in and interrupt our inner anxiety and our lack of purpose. If you don't feel purpose from what you do for work, and you don't have a meaningful family life or social life, that means actually doing something useful for other people, being useful to them, mattering to them, then you've got a big void to fill. He says, when jobs consist of little more than meaningless motions, and when social routines formerly dignified as ritual degenerate into role-playing, the worker, whether he toils on an assembly line or holds down a high-paying job in a large bureaucracy, seeks to escape from the resulting sense of inauthenticity by creating an ironic distance from his daily life or daily routine. He attempts to transform role-playing into a symbolic elevation of daily life. He takes refuge in jokes, mockery, and cynicism. Now, is this starting to sound familiar? Okay. There is this ironic, sarcastic sense of humor that attaches itself to a lot of even our political positions and our protests at this point in time. This here sign is, an example of that. It's a play on words of a, feminist phrase, my body, my choice, having to do with abortion, which of course this person would be against. But so here she's ironically, or sarcastically trying to say, well, if your body is your choice, so is mine. I don't want to wear a mask. Oh my gosh. How profound is that? Okay. Again, it's pathetic. But, this is the state of the world that we are in now. It's magnified beyond compare to when Christopher Lasch was writing this book. He points out that when we're like this, we're easy prey for propaganda, and he mentions cults, that we're prey for cults and therapies. The cults of the day are so manifold, right? But I would argue that when people get zealously involved, in their politics, lots of times, yes, the cause may be worthy, or maybe not, but it may be worthy. But lots of times when people get into it, it's because they want it for their identity. And so the action of protesting, let's say, wearing a t-shirt, holding a sign, whatever it is, becomes about the equivalent of putting your Nike shoes on. Same thing with being a Republican or a Democrat, okay? When it's about that, and we have to kind of dig deep and really ask ourselves, is it about that? Then when the protest or the vote doesn't really get anything done, which it normally does not, we don't notice that because we're too busy enjoying ourselves, like we did something, we expressed ourselves. I am who I am, right? Just deal with it. Meanwhile, we have facts, and a lot of you ask the question, why is it that we have these facts, but a lot of people don't seem to care anymore, if they ever did? I would say probably to a great extent, people never did care, but they care they don't care in a very aggressive way now, right? Like they don't care actively. Here's a graph that I wanted people to see. It's from the CDC, and it shows the affected by race of COVID-19 associated hospital rates, okay? So the largest percentage of the race with the largest percentage of hospitalizations is actually American Indian, and Alaska Native, followed very closely by non-Hispanic Black, then followed very closely by Hispanics and Latinos, followed by Asians, and then finally followed by whites, okay? So if you ask yourself, why is it that some white people, like the Costco man, think that it's all a ridiculous imposition on his freedom to wear a mask? This is why. It's because in his world, not that many people are affected by it, okay? And in his world, since he's a narcissist, and he can't think beyond himself, and he certainly hasn't looked at this, and even if he did, it wouldn't matter, because they're not him, okay? He doesn't care. He's not going to wear a mask. Here's another, this is a picture of risk of human-induced desertification from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is not a left-wing organization, let's say. It supports big ag in a very, very grand way. But you'll notice there in the United States region, since this is where I'm at, this is what I'm paying the most attention to, the big swath of middle is in the high area for desertification. If it desertifies completely, and some of it already has, we won't be able to grow anything on it. So you would think this would be alarming, but nobody's alarmed, okay? So again, Lasch helps us to answer the question, why is it that nobody cares, or even now aggressively doesn't care, right? Well, again, he offers an unusual answer, and the one that ought to give us pause, and it goes along with Jacques Ellul's ideas, among others, but Jacques Ellul is somebody that I've covered quite a bit on the channel. Lasch says, overexposure to manufactured illusions soon destroys their representational power. The illusion of reality dissolves not in a heightened sense of reality as we might expect, but in a remarkable indifference to reality. So Lasch is focusing here on the fact that so much of our world is now mediated, meaning that we get our reality, such as it is, indirectly through TV, through the internet, okay? And that is becoming more and more of a bizarre spectacle. of all sorts of weird views and extreme ideas, and a whole lot of hostility and argument. And it's a cavalcade, it's a train wreck, it's a, a carnival. Okay, it's the Christians being fed to the lions. And so we're conditioned by all that. And at a certain point, what he's saying is we become numb to it, and we no longer are asking the question, and maybe we're not capable of asking the question, what's real and what isn't, right? We got this technology and we ran with it and we've soaked ourselves in it. And he's seriously asking the question whether that was good, right? The question implies that maybe we ought to pull back and think about whether our reality should be so mediated. This reminds me also of David Foster Wallace's views in an essay that he wrote. I think it's called E Unibus Plurum or something like that. I'll put it in the show notes. But this is a quote from Lasch. He says, "The self-consciousness that mocks all attempts at spontaneous action or enjoyment derives, in the last analysis, from the waning belief in the reality of the external world, which has lost its immediacy in a society pervaded by, quote, symbolically mediated information." This is the source, according to Lasch, and I think David Foster Wallace too, of this ironic distance and this, tone of mockery and this inability to deal with reality or take responsibility for oneself, and maybe even much more importantly, for others, right? We are disintegrating as social beings. Lasch was writing here of the 60s hippies and their turn towards performative protest. Okay? And we now have a lot of performative protests, so this should be familiar. But Lasch says the delusion that street theater represented the newest form of guerrilla warfare helped to ward off an uneasy realization that it represented no more than a form of self-promotion by means of which the media stars of the left brought themselves to national attention with its concomitant rewards. He's complaining about the left-wing, movie stars and people like that. But in general, he's talking about people becoming, attached to the so-called radical performance, right? And doing that so that they can show that they're, whatever we want to call it now, woke, politically correct. Again, it's narcissistic. It becomes about self-expression. I just got to be me. Look at me. And at that point, you've got no change possible. So surely since the 1979 date when he wrote this book, we have become ever more like this. Our protests have become spectacle. And they are performative most of the time. Now, when we think of the latest one, Black Lives Matter, the fact that it spilled into non-performative protests and that there were moments of violence is unusual. And it's more real. We may not like it, but Black Lives protests started to break out of this pattern. And become more real. And I just think we ought to kind of contemplate the significance of that. Because I think most of the time in these types of protests, there's no real expectation of effect, right? The performance is the effect, right? But in this case, because those protests spilled over into something real, there's maybe a little bit more of a chance that something will be done, although for the most part what we've seen so far is symbolic gestures back, right? So this is a serious problem. These are pictures of Extinction Rebellion protests. Extinction Rebellion in many ways has adopted this performative stance, especially after some of the more overt attempts to kind of obstruct commerce and transportation got severely criticized by, in a lot of cases, working people who couldn't get to work or couldn't get to the hospital and so on. And so they turned towards performance and went back to this. But, again, when you do this, you basically attract people who yearn for self-expression and cult. So I'll leave you with this quote because it resonates so much with now. And I guess I'm thinking about the difference between, to the extent there is a difference between the current protests and what he's talking about. But he says, and this is 1979, remember, he says, the rhetoric of black power corrupted the white left and the black left alike, substituting a politics of the media for the civil rights struggles earlier waged in deadly earnest in the South. As the black power rhetoricians co-opted the civil rights movement, they also captivated white liberals who sought to appease the guilt associated with, quote, white skin privilege. By adopting the gestures and language of black militancy, both whites and blacks embraced radical style in place of radical substance. By the way, this is also a theme that Slavoj Žižek comes back to time and time again, that people consider themselves to be making some sort of statement and change simply through the performance of some sort of protest. But in reality, that protest, by the way it is done, has already been kind of co-opted and has no effect. The reason it has no effect is because it asks for nothing more, or it asks for very little, because the protest is itself the entire act. All right, so I guess that gives everybody enough to think about. I'll see you next week as we continue with Christopher Lasch's The Culture of Narcissism.